Thank you, Ernest. Good morning, good afternoon. I hope you are keeping well, and thanks very much for joining us. We've got an interesting session today. We're going to focus on East Africa. We're going to focus on, well, I suppose the subject of the moment, the Tanzania, and we're going to focus on Mozambique, where the crop is beginning and which is always a very interesting discussion. I'm going to start off by talking about the market and just generally about the market situation. I will ask one particular question. Again, I'm going to ask the question we spoke a little bit about last time, 2 weeks ago, when I said that there were some signs of a demand slowdown. I'm going to have another look at that, update some of the thoughts on that. And then we will talk about East Africa. And we're going to focus on East Africa. And just let's have a look at what's been happening. It's been an interesting period. It's not usually a particularly busy or volatile period, but it is certainly that this year. So I wanted to have a look a little bit from a calendar point of view, what's been happening and what's coming up. So over the last 4 weeks, we're going to take that. What we've seen is the East African crops have started, notably in Tanzania, Mozambique following on a little bit later. And the Brazilian crop, of course, have started. In the last 2 weeks, the Tanzanian auction has kicked off with real success, moving more volume than usual for the time of year, more volume earlier and at higher prices so far, which is really quite interesting. Looking at the reports from the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange, the pricing is remarkably high in many ways, and we're going to talk about that. And the volumes, I think something in the region of 80,000 tonnes has been sold, and that's way ahead of any of the last 3 or 4 years. So that's interesting. Within the last 2 weeks, the kernels market has started to firm up a little. Now, I'm not saying that the market has moved up notably on buying interest. I think it's moved up as processors have upped their export offers a little bit. We've seen high prices at the Tanzanian auction, and perhaps that's in response to the kernels prices, but more likely the kernels prices are in response to the perception that maybe there is a shortage of RCN. And I did say perception, I didn't say fact. We're going to talk about that too. And you do see a reaction. But what's very notable in the kernels market right now is how much different it is when processors try to lift their prices by increasing their offers and withdrawing back from the market than when they try to do the opposite. So when processors start to push the market down, buyers back off, prices immediately fall. When processors try to stir the market up and raise prices, well, buyers are far less likely to follow. And in that way, the market tends to move a little bit more slowly. If the kernels market is being driven by more and more buying interest, it can go up very quickly, as we all know, and we've seen that already twice this year. Over the last 10 weeks, and this is a much longer period, what we've seen is the misalignment of raw cashew nut prices and cashew nut kernels. In any logical world, you would expect that raw cashew nuts, the raw material, and cashew kernels, the product, would be aligned. That there would be a calculation that I could go out today and buy 1,000 tons of raw cashew nuts and at the same time sell 250, 280 tons of cashew kernels and at least on paper make a profit. You can't do that today, and you haven't been able to do it for weeks. And that is not unusual, but it is notable at this time of year when normally in this period demand is stronger than supply. And in the last 3 weeks, we will have seen the peak Diwali demand. Diwali's coming up just around the corner now, and Diwali holidays will be starting soon. And this is a period when Indian demand for cashew kernels peaks. It's a seasonal market. and this is the time of year when it peaks. And if you don't get good demand in this period in India, you've got to ask, when will we see good demand in India? That's what's been happening over the last 4 weeks, but some of those factors have been there much longer than that, and some of them will continue. What about the next 4 weeks? What are we likely to see? Well, we will see Indian demand subside a little post-Diwali. That's normal. There sometimes is a little bit of restocking after Diwali, but demand is normally less after the festival season. In the next 4 weeks, we will also see the retail demand in Western markets, again, for the winter holiday seasons, from Thanksgiving in the US all the way through to New Year, and even through to the end of January, February for the Super Bowl in the US. And that demand at retail level will peak, and it'll begin to subside into a much quieter period in the first quarter of the new year. Now, notably, I said retail demand here. We're talking about what the consumer is buying and how that's been distributed. The product to meet that demand was bought months and months ago. So sometimes people think because there are festivals, because Thanksgiving is coming, Christmas is coming in the Western countries, that you're going to see some demand in response to that. You don't. That demand, some of those products would have been delivered last June or July to processors to prepare for this season. Now, they may well engage in some restocking, but that won't happen probably until January, more likely February. These are companies that tend to buy forward, tend to cover themselves well in advance. In the next 3 to 4 weeks, we will also see the East African crop approach its peak. So Tanzania, with a great crop forecast, will continue, and the Mozambique crop will start to come in. A little crop in Madagascar too, not to forget that. We'll also see the arrival, maybe 3 to 5 weeks from now. 3 weeks is optimistic, I'd say, but maybe 5 weeks from now, we will see the beginning of the arrivals of this nice, high-quality Tanzanian RCN in India and Vietnam. Might be a little bit optimistic on the dates, but around about that. So processing in December and January, maybe into February in India. We will see a critical period now in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, again expecting a good crop in 2025. We're going to see flowering in Cambodia and flowering in Vietnam, and that will give us a good clue as to the condition of the next crop. And believe it or not, sometime in the next 8 to 10 weeks, which isn't that far away, the Northern Hemisphere crop will start again. So we'll start in Cambodia with early harvesting, and of course in Ghana, I mentioned Ghana simply as an example, but in West Africa we'll start to see December. Into January we'll start to see new crop arriving. So it's quite interesting now that we really are very close to the end of the season. Now in cashews we know that there's a long lead time between harvest and delivery of the raw material, but it is important to note the calendar, the upcoming, so we get an idea of exactly how the market might progress in the coming weeks. So I think in the next 4 to 5 weeks, about, based on forecasts from Tanzania and from Mozambique, about 500 to 550,000 tonnes will be harvested. That includes the remaining in Indonesia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and not to forget Brazil, which is also expecting a good crop. So that's going to happen in the next 4 weeks or so, but let's not forget that after that it takes 4 to 8 weeks to get to processors. And that's because in our industry, as we all know, the processing is located very remotely from the main growing areas. And that's something that perhaps is changing. But it does create a lot of obstacles to fast delivery and traceable delivery of raw cashew nuts to processors. So that's what's going on. That's what I think we can expect. Let's have a look at some of the more recent price trends. So we've certainly seen prices on RCN move up. If we look at this graph, there's a couple of things at play. Yes, prices have moved up. But secondly, let's not forget that the available quality at this time of year. So we're talking about Tanzanian raw cashew nuts, minimum £48, but a lot of material, 51, 52, high quality material. That's one of the reasons pricing is higher. Indonesian raw cashew nuts, very high quality. Again, pricing is higher. So that is one of the reasons why we see prices move a little bit higher at this time of year. But we have also seen a rise in the market. There's no doubt about that. There are some lower quality products available. Some of them are held at origin, a little bit in West Africa, and some is at destination, mainly in Vietnam, but also to a certain extent in India. Big question marks around these factors are: who owns that stock? How strong are they in holding it? And to what extent does higher prices in Tanzania suit them to help them move the balance of their stock? In other words, is there a squeeze in the market, or is there an effort to create a squeeze on supply of raw cashew nuts in the market at the moment? I mean, if you looked simply this year at supply and demand, you would definitely expect, with the lower crop, particularly in West Africa, in India, and in Vietnam, you would expect that there would be a tight position at the end of the year. But given the level of stock carried into the year, you wouldn't necessarily expect that there would be a tight squeeze and further rises in price at this time of year. So one of the big questions is, to what extent is this spike in pricing created, and to what extent is it a natural result of the fundamentals in the market? Let's have a look at kernels. And again, what we've seen on kernels is really that asking prices have moved up. And there are inquiries. There are a lot of inquiries for African cashew kernels at the moment. Those would be obviously based on fast delivery, for example. But other people are looking at quality. I know Tanzanian cashew kernels are in strong demand at the moment, and based on their quality, based on the availability. But volume is relatively light. So asking prices, and I'm picking a midpoint here. So I'm not talking about the top processors who may ask 15 or more cents above this level in Vietnam. I'm kind of picking a mid-price, mid-processor level. We're talking about 345 for 320s FOB. We can see that that price is now back where it hasn't been for a couple of years, back at the end of 2021 before we saw a decline in price. But prior to that, this range of pricing was pretty well sustained in the market. And if we go right back pre-COVID, right back to 2020, we would have been expecting that prices might rise to the current levels at that time. But obviously that was interrupted. And then we had this long period of low pricing. So if we look at this market around 345 offered for medium processors, and we start to consider some of the factors around that, if we look at the cost of raw cashew nuts, by my calculations, you're looking at, for Vietnamese processors, something in the region of $3.60. This is average cost, all grades. Indian processors, $3.89. And clearly, based on that, raw cashew nut prices are too high for profitable processing. And I mean profitable processing without speculation, without selling kernels now and buying the RCN later, or doing the opposite to that. But certainly making money in processing based on today's availability, today's pricing on both sides, raw cashew nuts and kernels, is really challenging. And that even applies in the Indian market, which is somewhat protected and which trades at much higher prices than the international market. So you've, at this moment in time, it is quite difficult to see where the next moves are coming from. We have sustained buying in Tanzania. We have some interest in kernels. We have plenty of offers of kernels, of course, but not too much traded volume. Where are we going from here? One of the things we could look at is demand. So let's have a look at demand and let's ask that question. Are there signs of a slowdown in demand? I'm going to start with raw cashew nuts, the in-shell cashew nuts. And if we look at monthly imports, so the red bar here is monthly imports in 2024 into Vietnam, as reported by Vietnamese customs authorities. And October is half a month. We only have the first 15 days figures so far. They were quite healthy. Now looking at it, you basically see that the market this year is lagging behind, not hugely behind, but lagging behind a little previous years. And there's no real sign of a slowdown in demand for raw cashew nuts from Vietnam at this moment in time. Now, whether they are in the hands of processors or traders is another matter, but there is no sign of a slowdown there as we look at it. If we look in India, again, now we're looking at import figures. So I draw my import figures from the Ministry of Trade, and the figures there we only have till August. We have informal figures for September. And again, August was quite strong. It seems like a long time ago now, but August was quite strong, and we would expect September figures to follow and then to ease off October, November, December. But you can see, looking at the figures, I think total imports 835,000 tons so far compared to 868 last year. You can see again, there's no real sign of a slowdown, and the strong start in Tanzania is an indicator of interest in further supplies of RCN. So the red trend line for India is interesting because that seems to indicate that India's imports might just spike up a little bit from September into October. You've got a couple of complicating factors in here. The ban in Cote d'Ivoire has really cast a long shadow over the market, delaying the arrival of raw material, which is probably much of it still on its way. We have the ban in Benin, which fortunately didn't really deprive the market of a lot of RCN, because Togo seems to have exported quite a lot in the last year. And from that point of view, what we've actually seen, rather than being deprived of supply has been delayed. And that may make the situation look a little bit different. More of that in a moment. Let's have a look at kernels. So we're having a look at Vietnamese cashew kernels exports, and we're looking at a chart which basically tells us the performance versus 2023. So 2023 was a very good year, the previous record. It'll be broken in 2024. And so each bar tells us by how much the exports for that month in 2024 exceeded, or in the case of February, were lower than the exports for the previous year. So what we are seeing is that very strong start to the year, little hesitation in June, fabulous July, but there is a strong trend, and in any other year, 8% up in the first half of October, 7% up in the first half of August would be noticed as a very strong performance. But in the context of the first half performance, we would have to say it looks like there might be a little bit of a slowdown in exports from Vietnam right now. And again, a lot of complicating factors in there. Obviously, the first factor to think about is higher prices. So that will impact certain markets more than others. We'll have a look at that in a moment. But there are also factors, contract delays, contract defaults, a greater supply of larger cashew nuts, given the importance of Cambodia now as a supplier, and given the poor crop in West Africa, with lower crops in, a little bit lower in Cote d'Ivoire, significantly lower in Guinea-Bissau, and lower at different levels right across the region in West Africa. So there is maybe sign of a slowdown in shipments from Vietnam. We'll have a look at the import figures. So we're looking here at European Union import figures. Now there's a time lag, but it can be helpful still to look at figures going back to August. Bear in mind, we have long shipment periods in this industry at the moment. So when we look at EU, this is the EU and the UK combined for comparison purposes over the past 3 years, and we see a really terrific performance in that region. Up about 10% for the year so far. These are actual imports rather than shipments from Vietnam. And what we're looking at is a really strong performance, 10% up on the year to the end of August. It may slow a touch, but it looks like it's been a really good year for demand in Europe. Again, with a strong underlying trend toward healthy snacking, convenience, very resilient consumers in the face of inflation. And now in 2024, we've seen easing of inflation, particularly food inflation, and more optimism in the economies. Low prices will have had a part to play in that too. But given that we haven't seen prices at retail level drop, as you might expect, given the prices of the last 2 years, this is quite a resilient performance. Look in the US, and again, we see remarkably strong performance in the US market. US imports are up 20%. We haven't seen a figure like this for decades. Up 20% in a given year is quite amazing. And it's not that 2023 was by any means a disastrous year. This is remarkable. And this is largely driven by price. Price is very, very important to the promotion, marketing, and development of the cashew sector in the United States. Interestingly, as an aside, that the factor of price has seen a little bit of a pushback on African cashew kernels over the last 12 months into the US market. So we are seeing advances in the African cashew kernels share in the European market, regardless of price change. But in the US market, actually, African cashew share has, I suppose it hasn't really grown at all. After quite a good first half, it hasn't really grown since. So again, there's no real signs of a slowdown in demand up to that period. So let's ask the question then again, same question that we asked the last time. Are there enough cashew nuts in the world? And of course, the unspoken part of that, in the world until Northern Hemisphere new crop. So we start with Vietnam. We'll have a quick look at the Vietnamese situation. So notably, the first thing is that the opening stock was strong this year. Both in India and Vietnam, there were strong opening stocks, given high levels of imports last year. The crop, some people will argue that the crop is larger than the number I put on the screen. If it is, it's not hugely so. It may be, my figure is based on hectares, average yield, and what we see talked about in the various agricultural forums in Vietnam. Imports, we know, imports 2.2 million tons, big number for the end of October, for the middle of October. And then Burma kernels, based mainly on Vinacast information, it calculates around 420,000 tons and probably more than that. Put that all together, take our exports, a little bit of domestic, and we come up with a balance of about 551,000 tons, or about 2 months' supply. So that's tight. That is very tight. Now, there may be additional stocks in there. The Burma kernels may be higher because it's imported under a variety of HS codes, so it's difficult to track it. The figure I have taken is conservative. It is a figure from Vinacast, and it hasn't been updated. So I'm being relatively conservative in that number. So this might be a little bit higher, but it is tight. There's no question about that. If we look at raw cashew nut imports for the year to date, down about 7% on last year. The first 2 weeks of October were about the same, within 1,000 tons of the same period last year. Now, last year, the second half of October was quite strong in terms of imports into Vietnam, so it'd be worth watching that figure when it comes out quite soon. Exports in October up, in the first 2 weeks of October, up by 8% compared to last year, and up approximately 18% to the middle of October versus 2023. So that's a really strong number. And it is a question, and it is something of a puzzle to try and figure out how is that supplied? How is that remarkable export performance? And it is a remarkable performance. How is that supplied? How is it met? So we need to look at the Burma kernels. So I think that the imports of Burma kernels, that's the unpeeled cashew kernels, mostly from African countries, is up by about 50%. It's a very big increase. Despite that, it looks as if the stock levels compared to 2 weeks ago when we did a similar analysis are reduced by about 17 days or about half a month. So it is tightening a little bit in Vietnam. There's no doubt about that. So it would need a pretty good performance in the second half of October to try and balance that back. In recent years, we've seen second half of October figures quite strong, but we've seen quite a wide variation. The highest was 194,000 tonnes, the lowest 112,000 tonnes. So you need to be at the top end of that range to start adding an additional month of stock in Vietnam. And this you can understand looking at that there is some concern. But essentially, we have to ask some questions here because we know that there are some supplies around. So what is afloat? What has been shipped from West Africa, perhaps from Guinea-Bissau, perhaps from Côte d'Ivoire, and has not yet been delivered? And what we have noticed this year is that the physical arrival of stocks into the market has impacted on kernels prices. Now that's indicative of a business that's underfinanced. If time comes to pay for your raw material, and you start to reduce your kernels price, it must be indicative that you're struggling for cash. And I think that may be the case in Vietnam. So that's the first question. The second question, what stocks are in Vietnam or in containers are arriving that aren't included in the import figures? Stocks of Burma kernels and stocks of raw cashew nuts. What are those volumes? We think they're significant, but it's never possible to absolutely answer that. That's different trading companies' business, and it's not something they would like to advertise. Either way, either if they're small or large, it's not something that they would like to advertise. Also, we know that the Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are available at auction if buyers choose to pay the price. They are very high priced for Vietnamese processors to try and meet international market pricing, particularly if they have sold contracts some months ago. But they are available, and they could be available for processing during January. Now, it'll only be January because once we get to the end of January, we get to the New Year festival, to Tet. I think it's the 25th of January, if I'm not mistaken. And that means it's slightly earlier this year. Not unusually earlier, but earlier than last year. And that, of course, will stop processing for that period, a couple of weeks of holidays when most factories won't be processing. So key factors supporting the supply in Vietnam have been a strong opening stock and the imports of Burma kernels. And that is managing, so far at least, to supply record 18% increase in cashew kernels exports. So the year will finish very strong. I don't think it'll finish at 18% up, but it will finish up in double digits. There's no doubt about that. Let's have a look at India. India now, again, we have relatively strong opening stock. I think my number is quite conservative on that. I've been conservative on the crop estimate. I've taken quite a low estimate of the crop. Initial forecasts for the Indian crop were 780,000 tonnes. We know it wasn't as good a crop as expected, so we've just plugged in a low number, 600,000 tonnes. Let's see where that leaves us. Imports 835,000 tonnes. That is to the end of August. So that's the official figures. I'm not going to guess on September or October just yet, but we would expect relatively healthy figures for imports in those periods because, one, we know that material from Guinea-Bissau came to the market a little bit later because it was almost all shipped through the port of Bissau this year. About 180,000 tonnes, according to our good friend John Rao. And that's well down, by the way, on the crop of the previous year. But that should be on its way and arriving in India. Processed, if we take a figure for 12 months, I'm estimating just under 1.8 million tonnes of raw cashew nuts to be used in India, which would leave a year-end balance very tight. Now, let's explain that a little bit. This would be a year-end balance if no more imports came into the country. But obviously, more imports are coming into the country during September, October, November, and December. But it is an indicator that although there might be a lack of high-quality raw cashew nuts in India at times during the year, overall the volume should be available. Indian demand is always pretty good, but growth in Indian demand appears to have been quite sluggish this year. So the situation in India is quite subdued. If I calculate on what we know now and what we expect, I think Indian imports will finish something like 1.14 million tonnes, which would be slightly down on last year, which was a good year. Now, 1.14 million tonnes, that means that the imports over the last 4 months would go from 835 to 1.14. And the difference gets added on here. So that would suggest that there may be enough inventory in India not to justify stop buying, but to justify ordered, careful buying that makes sense. In terms of cashew kernels, we're talking here about the largest market in the world. India consumes somewhere in the region of 35 to 37% of all the cashews that are consumed in the world. Demand is under a little bit of pressure in India at these higher prices. Now, we're basing that on reports. There are no statistics that we can use, but certainly if we look around the market, and I chat to people, I listen to people's reports, I even look in social media in India, and certainly it does appear that demand is under pressure at higher prices. And it's under pressure because we have higher prices, but also because we have other nuts, almonds, for example, imported in North India, which are available more competitively. So high prices might damage the high end of the market. Gifting holds demand, which was an area that had been hoped would grow quickly this year. Some interesting presentations were made at the All India Cashew Association conference back some weeks ago. And what was suggested at that was that there was demand growth at the top end of the market, gifting and snacking, and demand growth at the lower end of the market in catering, but that the traditional uses in the middle were pretty sluggish. And it wouldn't be surprising, given the rise in prices, that would turn out to be correct for the year. So if I calculated, India might need something like 300,000 tonnes until the new crop in India. The new crop in India, we probably should start to plug in end of February as a realistic time for that. So 300,000 tonnes on top of the exports. It's a significant part of what's available, with about 120,000 tonnes already available in Tanzania, mainly sold, of course, plus about 550 to arrive into the market. 300,000 tonnes is a significant chunk of that. But there is the question as to, looking at the current raw cashew nut prices, how does that calculate for processors? And one of the key factors I think that can influence demand in India is the reduction in processing capacity. If people behave logically and they reduce their capacity when they're losing money, then you would expect less availability of kernels in the domestic market. That will impact prices to a certain extent, but if they're not available, you can't buy them, you can't consume them, and therefore you would see a little bit of a circuit of pressure on demand as a result. So looking at this market situation, demand-wise, supply-wise, and pricing, we think that Western demand is strong and remains strong, but it has done so based on lower import prices and strong underlying consumer demand trends. Next step, how does this behave when the higher prices really bite into supply? Given that in those markets, most people have bought forward, and if they're not working off low price contracts still, they're working off some kind of an average that has an element of low price contracts in there. If we look in markets in India and China, where there's less forward buying, markets are more responsive to price, there does appear to be something of a slowdown. That might also apply to markets in Western Asia, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, where price might come to play in the market a little bit more quickly. And there are some indications of that in the shipment figures from Vietnam. Supply-wise, overall, it looks like very good crops in the Southern Hemisphere. Obviously, they're not all in yet, but it does look good. But let's not get too excited about it, because Southern Hemisphere is much smaller crop than the Northern Hemisphere, and the good crops will add only about 4% to the overall production figure. But it does mean that there's good supply coming to the market in this period from September through to January. So for me, if we take the numbers, now this doesn't mean that the supply reaches the market. What it means is that if all the supply becomes available and can be bought and can be processed, that there's no real problem of supply. Intervening in that, though, are high prices, slow shipments, the auction system, which may take more time than a straightforward market system, the restrictions on exports from certain countries to protect local processing. All of those things come into play. So based on that, for now at least, I think kernels prices look sustainable. I think kernels prices at these levels can work. I think that they make sense for a lot of people. That's not to say we won't see a dip around the full supply from West Africa from end of February onwards. But at these levels, I think it can work for growers, it can work for consumers, it can work for processors. But raw cashew nut prices look too high. They look too high against the kernels price, they look too high against historical prices, and that is a big issue right now. Now, there is a problem with this that could cast a long shadow over the market. If we go into Northern Hemisphere new crop with very high raw cashew nut prices, buyers will delay buying. So if we look at buyers in Vietnam, for example, they have a different situation today. 5-6 years ago, they primarily relied on West Africa. But now, with the crop in Cambodia, probably this year hitting 850,000 tons, and I wouldn't bet against Cambodia producing a crop close to 1 million tons in the coming year. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying it's possible. Vietnamese buyers have a different time frame in terms of their access to supply from West Africa. So coming in with very high prices on raw cashew nuts that are not in line with kernels can have an impact right back to the farm gate in West Africa come January, February, March. And we do need to be aware of that, and we do need to be aware of the disruption that that could cause. So that's the market situation.